Is Jordan Peterson tabulating himself as a radical atheist? Um, Pros and cons against this contention. Um, so to make the argument, I go back to The Clouds by Aristophanes, where Aristophanes maintains that the philosophers are atheoi, without gods. That's a long discussion about showing just what that means. And so have they come out onto a hillside where the fine scent of the perennial evergreen junipers is wafting by, or rather have they taken the first step on building this Stahlhartes Gehäuse, or the steel-clad house or iron cage of Max Weber, of these ready-made, rational decision-making bureaucracies, such as the so-called deep state, which increasingly are automated in their decision-making power with respect to the future of all the people on the earth. Certain goals have been set, such as goals in terms of gross national product, or in terms of some form of claiming that this is a good life in terms of the economic statistics. Um, so maybe the philosopher did take the first step towards the so-called technological essence, but at every point there might have been openings there. But then again, the case for that isn't quartz crystal clear in every respect. So the philosophers being branded the atheist doesn't necessarily mean they're atheists, but what that means immediately is that the theos is or theoi have been replaced by the ideas. And so instead of Nike, the god of victory, you have the idea of victory, and you can analyze it without the statue or without the image of the god, in the same with all the other gods, whether it's Hermes or Hera, goddess of marriage, or crooked-minded Kronos, god of time, or whatever else. We can take it apart from the ogony, or from the cosmologies told in terms of the playing out of the lives of these gods, that could then also be pictured. It could even be ready at hand on the stage, in a sense, be staged, and bring it into the realm of the generalizing and generic ideas. Uh, the meaning of this is not quite clear. So, okay, that's, in some sense, I want to say Peterson is coming into this already available with possibility in the West of being the kind of person that does analyzing into things, drilling down into things with thought, which is aimed, in a certain sense, with the open aim, but in another sense, with the aim of helping human beings, and possibly with the aim of giving more clarity to an account of what is happening overall in Toto. So starting on that foundation, we can see where, in the analysis of Christianity, so far as it includes the last 2,000 years, we come through the Aristotelian tradition, although there was the Church Fathers and especially Augustine of Hippo, uh, had also other authorities such as Plato and the Neoplatonists. There's all kinds of questions in there, and there's other thinkers aside from the Suarez and Thomas, and the main theologians that have picked up their Aristotelian tradition, but then have become codified in the West, and have in some way survived into the whole higher culture, so far as there was a higher culture up to about the time of Hegel or so. And thinking into things in a certain multi-storied manner was understood and pursued, such that after a couple hundred years, I think it was no less the thinker William James, who was very excellent, said that only when doing nitrous oxide or laughing gas could he understand Hegel. So that could be taken in several ways. It could be taken to mean only when his ordinary consciousness was distorted, his ordinary consciousness being the standard of any ordinary consciousness, could he understand these strange, far-out ideas of Hegel. But it could also mean that the gulf between those 200 years and between those nations, and that Prussian consciousness of Hegel and what it was took for granted as pursuing and worthy of pursuit differed so much from the consciousness of the American William James with a different mother's milk, who, the Chinese saying, they're fish in the water, or the different water that he's used to, right? Henry James pretty much took the tack of somebody like Sam Harris, although at a greater level of refinement of thought. The thought was still, in his time, more refined than it's become today. Probably, if one had to say why, it would be because of the increasing necessity to speak to a large audience and to appeal to commercial success. So, in fact, Heidegger observes with horror that a theologian about 1850 in his correspondence said, I have to find a subject matter for my next book, meaning that his publishers are at him for his next book, and therefore, in order to fulfill this demand, not exactly publish or perish, but just the market demand, and to supply something to the popular audience, he must write a book. So therefore, the thing is preposterous in Heidegger's view. In other words, instead of the actual subject matter of philosophy, which it should be first, and which one should stay with, the audience is made the measure of what a theologian should write in his book. So instead of discovering something and then writing about it, he says, I have to sell something to the audience. Well, I got to cook something up. So that may have to do with the lack of passion for thought at the level of a Hegel or who became for him Leibniz, which today probably simply requires too great a propedeutic. Heidegger's talking about 25 years of Aristotle and then some other thinkers, even just to get started, the whole Western tradition. And it's also doesn't carry the same, it's almost itself like some urine stench, the acrid smell of the cage or something. There's some strange animals in here that are fascinating in a way, the fight of the great philosophers, but nobody today finds that particularly glamorous or is drawn towards it. When you see some who are sort of drawn towards it, um, it's very rare that they're not in part have some kind of what do you call it, like a peacock tendency, or that it's interesting because it's avant-garde intellectualism or some lower motive. Of course, on the other end, that could be true really at any time. Okay, but what I wanted to get to is that coming through Thomas and this Christian tradition, we can see that philosophy plays a central role. And then, for instance, even Thomas says you start with philosophy, and why should you need anything more? In introducing the scientific concept of theology, which, however, had already been introduced by Aristotle. Whereas in the other so-called monotheisms, there is no such praise made of philosophy. The only thing that gives one to believe that falsely is that Maimonides has written this guide to the perplexed, which means a guide to the non-believer, which is people that could only handle philosophy. But that's an accidental book and wasn't what made his fame during his lifetime. It became more popular later when theology started to lose its pride of place and was replaced by philosophy as it was becoming science, as it was becoming logical positivism, let's say, which is sort of the nursemaid of science in some sense, or the nursemaid of experimental science. So what I'm going to say is, if we place Jordan Peterson in this Western tradition, it seems like the core of this tradition is already predetermined as atheist. So actually, it's not at all surprising that he says this thing that he doesn't believe, but he would only act as though he believes in God. What would further remain is to ask about the actual contents of this so-called claim about is it that the theoi, the gods, in this sense, used in Plato's Euthydemus, and the demands of the gods is absolutely at the same level as the agathon, or the highest good. There's some questions about that. The agathon is the foundation of everything. It somehow has a different status than any of the other ideas. There's various other questions here about what we're talking about. Of course, so Cicero says the theoi, or the theos, what the Greek means by the theos is the ego arbiter, which is something like, our active judgment. So that we make, we deliberate and come to decisions in an aware way, which then can be called reason, in contradistinction to mere instinct, or to anything that was programmed by a behaviorist or conditioned response schedule or something like that. But that there's a cardinal difference between its reflexes, instincts on the one side, and this rational, both inference making, like that I say, this audience is interested in questions about Western religion, which is Christianity. So maybe I draw the inference maybe this is also since this subject of Western religion and theology coincide in some way with philosophy and science, there must also be others within philosophy and science. Uh, I may be mistaken in that, but but it's inactive reasoning. It's not. So apparently, we're supposed to be able to make a distinction between this kind of thing and uh, reflexively coming to some decision or actions, or instinctually doing it without the thought. Because there's acts associated with that. Like say, I think here's an audience that would be receptive to thought and some philosophy. But instead of ever going through that, I could have just immediately glanced at the audience. Boom, I get some kind of intuition, and then I start trying to see if this works with them. So you could have the same thing instinctually, I suppose, rather than placing it in the sense of the syllogistic inference machine. Um, that's a kind of unclear, in some way, primary ground distinction, which could take quite a number of forms. So, but this kind of problem is somehow in the background, on the threshold of what we're willing to say is cogent or makes sense or it's worth, or somehow protrudes in a way that we have to follow it up, and which we, other problems which we probably wouldn't say that. And I think part of the reason Schopenhauer is rarely studied as a thinker is because basically the center of his thinking is the collapse of this distinction between uh, conscience, reasoning, and instinct. But it seems on the face of it unintelligible how he can uh, proceed once he's made that collapse to say anything worthy of saying. I think Schopenhauer is studied for a lot of his writings on other subjects aside from his core thinking on the appearances and the will, because he's written a lot about theory of literature and other philosophy of daily life.